Okay, it looks like we're ready to go. This is Bradmark Technologies webcast, surveillance for MongoDB and PostgreSQL. Thanks very much for everyone joining us today. Hope everyone continues to be safe during these difficult times. My name is Tim Joseph. I'm the Technical Support Manager for Bradmark, and I'll be attempting to moderate the webcast. Everyone will be muted when they join, and if you wish to ask a question, kindly submit it via the Q&A tab, and the questions will be answered at the end. The webcast is being recorded, so it'll be available later. This is part 2 of Bradmark's product preview session, presenting the latest database support in Bradmark Surveillance 5.1. Today, Ed Stangler presents a special deep dive session featuring performance monitoring support for MongoDB and PostgreSQL. Ed, are we ready to go?
Yes, thank you very much. Again, everybody, thank you very much for joining. We really appreciate it. As Tim mentioned, this will also be recorded if you want to share the webinar with other colleagues. We also invite you to attend some of our upcoming deep dive webinars. On November 10th, we'll be having a webinar covering Neo4j, as well as enhancements to our web reports and time slicing features in Surveillance 5.1. And on November 17th, we'll be having another webinar for how to migrate to Surveillance 5.1. So if you're an existing customer on version 4, I definitely don't want to miss that one, where we'll be talking about the various issues about upgrading and how things are different in 5.1. But today we're going to be talking about MongoDB, deep dive of MongoDB, as well as PostgreSQL, and then we'll have questions at the end. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit quickly about just surveillance in general. For those of you who haven't seen the product before, Bradmark Surveillance is a monitoring product for monitoring databases on premises in the cloud and in container databases. We have a lot of different metrics that cover a lot of different areas. We have historical metrics that you can access even when the database is offline. So if you want to do a postmortem analysis of a problem that happened yesterday at 3 o'clock, for example, or last week, you can easily do that in the product. We have reports for compliance if you need to do auditing or other types of situations like that. We also have a lot of built-in security items in the product to help with compliance. And of course, we have a lot of in-depth metrics for each of the databases that we monitor. Some of our major features include time slicing, which allows you to go back in time to, let's say, 3 o'clock yesterday or last week, or if you just want to see during the daytime what's the top running SQL, you can easily see that in the product. We also have our flashback feature, which lets you go back in time to a particular point in time, so you can go back to yesterday and then correlate different windows at that time period to see what's going on. We also have web reporting, which allows you to generate reports for long-term analysis, let's say like space analysis over time, that can be generated on the web as well as on PDFs. And then, as I mentioned, audit reports. We have better security compliance to help you pass things like PCI DSS and other types of compliance situations. And of course, we also have an alerts dashboard that allows you to see red, yellow, green status of alerts by database, by server, and those kinds of things. Now, one of the things that we're doing in 5.1 is we're really expanding the product to cover NoSQL databases. We've traditionally been a relational database monitoring product, and now we're really getting into NoSQL databases with the same kinds of things that we brought to the relational world. Because we've been doing relational database monitoring for many, many years. We're bringing those technologies as much as we can, and we're covering all the critical areas. This is a little bit of a rehash of what we did during our first webinar. But briefly, whatever is currently running, we definitely monitor what's out there, what's been slow in the past. Space usage, hot objects, change settings, and those kinds of things are available for the NoSQL databases. We have all of our critical features that we brought over as well. Things like alerting, uptime SLA reports, so you can see if you have, let's say, 100%, 99% uptime on a database or on a server. You can also see recent history, the flashback point in time in the UI, as well as the long-term web reporting as well. The other thing that we bring to NoSQL is easy setup. we try to do, because with NoSQL, especially with open source software and other types of things, there's sometimes a lot of dependencies, a lot of things to install. We try to make it as simple as possible. We try to include as much as we can in the product to help you get going right away. We have minimal dependencies that you need to install. As well as we also provide deep dive metrics. So there's a lot of metrics that are very challenging to obtain in NoSQL systems. We try to go and find those. We try to help you correlate those metrics, to summarize those metrics for more meaning. And of course, we try to provide as many drill downs as we can for that information. So as you see, we'll see in a little while, some of the information that we get is difficult on its own to get, or maybe difficult to process, and we try to make that as easy as possible. Now, of course, there's several different categories of NoSQL. There's document stores, things like MongoDB, which we'll be talking about today. That's really unstructured data. So anything that's like an app, there may be apps that are storing JSON, for example, that could be a document store. We also have graph databases like Neo4j, which we'll cover in an upcoming webinar, and then other types of NoSQL like Redis and other key value stores and those kinds of things as well. Now, with our Surveillance 5.1 product, we have a couple of new monitoring pieces. We have the monitoring for MongoDB, Neo4j, and we've also done enhancements to web reporting and some other miscellaneous items like 64-bit on Windows. So, surveillance for MongoDB in Surveillance 5.1. MongoDB, again, is a document store for unstructured data like JSON for applications or actual documents as well. Now, what's interesting about Mongo is that things are a little bit different than a relational database, of course. There is commands instead of SQL statements. So when you're looking at what's currently running, we're talking about, in addition to maybe what connections are out there and who's connected, we're talking about what commands are running. We have collections instead of tables. So we're looking at things that are stored. We're looking at what collection is hot as a hot object, for example. What's going on with the collections? What's the I/O on the collection? So it's collection oriented instead of table oriented, like there was in relational databases. Now, MongoDB is available on premises or cloud. We can do both. We can handle monitoring Community Edition as well as Enterprise Edition. And then we also do extensive and critical monitoring in MongoDB, as opposed to some other options. We're not limited to 24 hours of history. We don't have limited metrics. We have much more than 24 hours of history, and we have a wide variety of metrics available for MongoDB. We can provide you with weeks of recent history of important details, and then you can have much longer amount of data available in the central repository as well. So it allows you to really have a better view of the database for a longer period of time. And this is the kind of screen that we have in MongoDB where we have hot collections, for example, and we'll see more about that a little later. So the main areas that we monitor in MongoDB include the following, which is a little bit similar if you already seen our relational products. We have an overall health view that shows what's going on with the MongoDB at a high level. We have global statistics, and there's a lot of different global statistics that we're graphing over time. And that includes active sessions. That includes several different metrics regarding connections. We have several different metrics regarding lock queues, as well as several on active locks. And of course, memory usage is covered. And in some versions, there's also network usage as well. We also have monitoring over locks. What are outstanding locks? What are locks trying to be obtained? We also have error log monitoring as well. And also MongoDB, we have connections, and of course we have all the information that you would want for connections, like the IP address and the users and those kinds of things for the connections. Of course, we have to show the current executing commands that are going on in MongoDB, and with those current executing commands, we have the full command text available. In fact, we have the full command text available in several different windows, including connections, for example. And then we have database space usage. So we have the overall usage in terms of a percentage as well as the absolute amount of space. We also have the system settings for MongoDB. We have all the settings, which is searchable and savable and those kinds of things. And then we also have only the change settings as well. So if you're looking to see what's the non-default settings are for this particular instance of MongoDB, you can easily see that and search that as well and save that off. And of course, collection activity is available as well. So if you're looking for the hottest objects in there, what's being hit the most, the different rates of that, the collection activity is where that would be. And it's also available in real time and in recent history. Speaking of recent history, of course, we have something similar. This is the time slicing feature that I mentioned earlier. Our recent history is available by time range and by hour of day, and you can see the top commands in the Mongo instance, as well as the top collections in terms of activity on the collections. And those are available. You can look at it for today. You can look at it for yesterday between 3 and 5 o'clock, or you can look at it last week or a few weeks ago even. So some details about our monitoring for MongoDB. Surveillance can monitor MongoDB versions 3.6 to the latest, which is 4.4 that just came out. Of course, there's a lot of different things you can get in different versions, but we try to provide a similar experience as much as possible, as well as going into the newer features of the newer versions. The executable inside of our product is called DBG MGDB. We would like to call it DBG Mon, but unfortunately we already use that in several places in the product, so the next best thing was DBG MGDB. Which sounds like some other things, but that's the name of the executable. Of course, a lot of our executables are called DBG something, so it's just in line with that. When we connect to the database, we're using the MongoDB C driver, which is libmongec and libbson. Now, we also provide the driver in our distribution as an automatic support pack. So if you're familiar with our product and how it works, we have sometimes support packs for different databases to automatically handle different versions of the database that are installed and other types of things like that. So we automatically provide the C driver in a support pack that gets automatically selected. So that's one thing you don't have to install in order to get right away going on MongoDB. When you connect to the Mongo database, when you create the entity in the product, it follows the familiar kind of pattern where you have a host name and an optional port and then the /database if you like on that as well. So it's very similar to when you connect to Mongo with the Mongo client, except normally you might type in Mongo : / in front of all of that. So we just do that without that part, and so it's a very natural way of connecting to the entity. And entity, by the way, is our name for the database connection, in case you're not familiar with that. And then in terms of role requirements, the user that we connect to the database needs to have at least cluster monitor role. Of course, it can be more than that. It can be cluster admin or something like that. But if that's just for the monitoring components. Now, if you want to actually terminate commands, which you can do easily through the UI. You can, like for example, in the currently running commands window, you can select a command that's running and you can kill it directly from there, and then it's going to prompt for a user to use to terminate that command. So the user that's used to terminate the command that does the kill op may need additional permissions like host manager or cluster admin role for that particular case. Now, surveillance, when we're showing commands, we're showing native commands from Mongo when we're showing that in like the currently executed statements or the connections windows. The native commands in Mongo are in BSON format, which is an extension of JSON. It's binary, whatever, but it's in BSON format. So, for example, you can see here there's one. It's in JSON format essentially. You have aggregate, and then which is the name, and then the value. So you have this long command that's the native format for the command. But you may be more familiar with it in the Mongo client, for example. In the Mongo client, you see at the bottom is what the top part. The top part is the native command, and then the bottom part you can see db.tempdatabases.aggregate, blah, blah, blah. That's the Mongo client command. So so we're showing the native version of that, so it may not be what you might see in Mongo client, but that's just because that's the way the Mongo is processing it. And so there's a correlation, a little bit of a correlation, like the db dot part is purely a syntax item in Mongo client. The .aggregate part is a syntax item, and then the correlation between native commands and client commands or API calls in your programs, your apps. The correlation between that is a little bit complicated and stuff like that, so it's not quite straightforward in all cases. But there's definitely a way that it goes about doing it. But it's maybe a little bit different if you haven't seen that before. Now, if you're familiar with the Mongo client, it's actually an interactive JavaScript shell. So, and that has kind of implications for monitoring a little bit. Now, when I'm talking about Mongo client, I'm talking about the traditional Mongo client. In 4.4, they have a new Mongo SH, which is a Node.js utility. So, some things are still applicable, but it's basically I'm talking about the Mongo client here. So when you're actually running commands on Mongo client, you're actually running JavaScript stuff usually. So when you run something on there, it could be running completely in the Mongo client and not actually running on the server component, which makes things a little bit, if you're trying to look at something, it may not be completely obvious. You may be doing some kind of like loop or something like that on the Mongo client or in another API or another program that's using Mongo, and maybe doing something, but it's not actually touching the server yet. So there's the correlation between what you're running and versus what's actually in the server is a little bit sometimes non-trivial on that. So for example, if the aggregate function that we saw earlier where it was db.collection.aggregate or whatever, that's actually a function, and if you were to type in the Mongo client db.aggregate, you'll actually see the JavaScript code for that function. So it's a little bit not trivial when you first see that, but rest assured at some point, whatever you're typing gets sent to the server and shows up as a native command inside Mongo. Now, in order to deal with this, we have something called user-defined collections. If you're familiar with our product, that's a way of extending our product to use, your own commands or your own, in the relational world, if you're doing your own SQL statements, you can easily bring that into the product. It can become a first-class collection. You can do rules. You can do stores against it. So in the UDC, you can also do that in Mongo. And to help with that, in addition to the native commands, and the native command is still the center part of the UDC, so you still have a native command of some kind. But to help with that, also to deal with some other items along the way, we also emulate some commands from the Mongo client. So, for example, the use database command is something that's kind of essential in some areas. That's actually currently available in UDC. These other items like drop, save, admin command, run command, those are actually not currently available in our UDCs, but we're hoping to bring them soon. But they are used in the product in general. So this is the kind of thing that we're doing in order to help emulate the Mongo client in some areas and try to make it a little bit easier to run some kind of commands, because it is a little bit difficult sometimes to run it in BSON format. And of course, whatever you're doing in UDCs or in our factory collections or other places like that, we're taking the output from MongoDB from the command and we're turning it into a tabular result. If you're familiar with running commands in Mongo, the output is actually BSON or JSON, and sometimes it's difficult to go through. So we automatically take care of a lot of things in order to be able to show it in a format that's more tabular, for example. So we'll go ahead and look a little bit at MongoDB. Switch over here. So here we are in the surveillance web client, and I'll go ahead and log into it. This is actually a Surveillance 5.1 product. And you can see I have a MongoDB and I also have my Postgres agents out here. If you're not familiar with our product, we have our agents running out here. We have things like our alerter agent that does the alerts. The analyzer actually runs rules that sends the alerts to the alerter agent. We also have OS monitoring and a repository agent that actually stores the historical data on there as well. So here I have MongoDB, and I have actually two database connections. And so I have an older version of Mongo, and then I have a 4.2 instance out here. And you can see here are the views that we have for MongoDB, correlating to some of the areas that we cover. So to give you an example, we'll go ahead and bring up the global window, which has several different metrics out for Mongo. Now here we have our usual global window. If you're familiar with our relational products, and we have 8 hours of history out here, which scroll through and zoom in and out on here, just like a lot of our graphs on here. And you see here we had not much activity going on until just recently. So right around about 40 minutes ago, we started having a little bit of activity going on this particular instance. We started having some more sessions going on. We can see the number of connections. We can see how many connections are available if that's an issue. We have several different statistics for lock queues, and you can see here we started getting a bit of items, a little bit of activity in the queues. Readers, writers, total active, total number of writing locks are on here as well. And then we have memory usage, and in some versions we have network input throughput as well. So a lot of different items on here. Of course, just like a lot of grids in the product, we can save this off to a spreadsheet. We can copy this, search it. So if I just wanted to look for sessions, I could look for just that, for example. And that's especially useful for some of the other windows like collections, where that's useful. Under connections, we can see what connections are currently out there. We can see the connection ID, the username, the application, whether it's active, the elapsed time. So here we have something that's been out there running for a few hundred milliseconds. And here, when we click on it, we can see the full command text. So in this case, this is doing a create with some additional information. If we look over here, it's doing the same thing, I think. Let's see here, find something load. This is our product itself, where we're doing an aggregate pipeline here command. So we have the full command text. So even if it's very long or very short, we can easily have that available here. Of course, you can copy and paste that as well. So over here, again, we have some things going on, some activity, a little bit of concurrent activity going on. And this is what, in this case, a lot of times, Mongo commands may be very, very quick. But in the case when you have, let's say, concurrent activity and you have contention, as is the case going on right here, then you start to see things like the elapsed time going up, the yields and those kinds of things. You can see the current database it's in, the collection that's being involved. In this case, it's a collection called temp. In other cases, it may be a $command or something like that out there. If we scroll over to the right here, we can also see locks that are taken out. So we have lock weight information. We have the operation information. So here we have some inserts going on. The global lock, we have a W for global lock. We have a database lock, collection lock. So you can see all three locks available here. If there is a latch weight going on, you can see the name of that. The various informations about the latch weights. We can also see the IP address from this. So this is actually coming from a local system, but some other ones are coming from a different IP address. We also have the OS name, the client port, those kinds of things, and the host, of course, that it's listening on. So a lot of different information, and we also have this broken down by user connections and system connections. Now these are not real connections out here, but more internal items from Mongo. We can see a listing of this as well, in case that's an issue for you, or if it's not running, for example, that might be something to take a look at in the connections. We also have information on locks that are outstanding. So similar to how we have it for connections, we have it, but in terms of locks themselves, they're outstanding. And you can see here we have a lock weight going on. We have a global lock, database locks taken out, collection locks, nothing in terms of latches. And of course, when you click on this, you can also see the full SQL text for that particular connection ID that's out there doing this. If we want to look at it in terms of the actual commands that are running, instead of looking at it by connections or locks, we can also do that. Here you can see that we have user ed 5.0 is running this particular aggregate pipeline, and then we have the other ones that are running out here. These are actual local connections, so they don't have a username. But you can see the elapsed time for those as well. We have a preview of the command, and then, of course, the full command. The application, and if we pull over here, is the similar kinds of things we saw under connection, the lock information, and the client information as well. So you can see that by what's actually running out there. We also have database space usage. So here we have, for example, several different databases out there. The one that's the activity is happening against is actually the zip codes database. This is the zip codes sample data set that you see off the Mongo site. And you can see here, in terms of the total bytes being used by all databases, this is accounting for 75% of that on here. So you can easily see that in terms of total usage as well. Under system settings, as I mentioned, we can see all the settings, or we can see only the items that are different. So here are my non-default settings that I can go through, and of course, and again, I can search through this. So if I want to look for example, Java-related ones, I can see that easily through here. You can also save this off to a spreadsheet to see what are different. So if you're looking to see how has this instance been configured, you can easily see that through the change settings, or you can see all the settings if you want and search this as well. We also have collection activity. So these are like the equivalent of tables from relational databases, and you can see the kinds of activity we're having. Now I've just brought up the window here for a moment ago. It's going to refresh in a moment, and then we'll start seeing some information about total per second, things like that. I'll go ahead and force a refresh here to kind of see this a little bit earlier, but you can see here in terms of total operations per second, I have the most active is my zip codes collection going on. I have certain total operations, and we break that down by queries, commands, get mores. Get mores are operations on the cursors, for example, getting more information. The read locks, the write locks. So you can see that in terms of the operations per second, or we can see total amount of operations here as well. Remove time, remove count, update count, insert, those kinds of things are all available as well. And of course, we also have the error log information. I don't have anything at the moment in my error log, but you can see the full error log text and the timestamps and those kinds of things. So in addition to this, we can actually also go back in time just like we can in our other products. So here we have right now a lot of things going on. It's a fairly idle system though, but it's a concurrent operation going on. We'll go ahead and go back in time. So let's go back in time to, let's say, 6 hours ago. And we'll go ahead and flash back to that point in time. So now we flash back to 6 hours ago, and it was much more idle back then. We didn't have the concurrent operations running. And I can easily go up here, and I could go, let's say, 10 minutes at a time, and then I could go backwards and forwards to the time period that I need. And then I could open up other windows as well, because we can come up here, for example, and open up a new tab. So now we have 2 tabs, and I can open up another window at that particular time period. Let's say I open up connections, and I can see that, okay, these are the connections that were out there at that time as well. These are the commands that we're running, and I can easily correlate that. And then I'll go ahead and just flash right back to the future. So here we are back again and see the concurrent operation going. So that's for a particular point in time. And we also have our time slicing feature under recent history. And I can take a look at commands for a particular time range. So for example, in the past 3 hours, I'm going to go ahead and say, give me the top commands that have been running. And this will consult the local cache repository stores. Those cache repository stores, you can easily set how much data you want to keep, how much you want to export to the central repository for more longer-term data. And here I can see the top items out there, and I can see the full SQL text of all the different items that are out there. And in this case, we have a lot of different commands. There's a rename collection command going on. Those kinds of things are all available here. You can see the elapsed time on there. And this can be run for different time periods. So you can go back to yesterday between 3 and 5 o'clock, or you can go back to last week at this time period to see how things were going at that particular time. And we can also take a look at it in terms of collection activity. So here we'll go back, let's say, during the same time period of 3 hours ago to now. We'll go ahead and take a look at the collection activity, and you can see that the dominant collection activity has been on the zip codes table, collection, excuse me, as well as some other items as well. We can see that in terms of total time. We can see total count of operations. Again, we break down the operations by query time, query count, command time, get more time, and then those kinds of things. Now, that's one way to look at it in terms of time, but we can also take a look at it in terms of I/O activity. So here we are looking at it in terms of total time, and then relock time, write lock time, insert time. So you can really see a nice breakdown of what kind of areas this was being used in, how much time was being used in those different areas as well. So this is also savable in spreadsheet format. So that's one way to look at it, is during a particular time range, but we can also take a look at it in terms of hour of day. So if I want to, let's say I want to look at it over a particular time period and see throughout the day, what is the command that's using the most time. And here we can see that, okay, I have a lot of things running at 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock. So I can click on this and I can see, okay, here's my aggregate pipeline command. Okay, I got some other things going on. This, of course, is on the zip codes collection as well. And I can see that, okay, this orange item, for example, is being run at the same time, both of these hours. If I can see throughout the day, maybe there's something that's taking up the most time. Maybe there's several items that are taking up the most time. You can easily see that through this. And this is in terms of commands. We can also take a look at this in terms of collections. So we'll run the same kind of report over that time period in terms of collections. And this will just take a moment here to come up. But when we do see this, we can see this breaking down into different areas. And now, in terms of total time, we can see, okay, this is the zip codes collection is definitely taking up the most time throughout the day. But we can also take a look at it in terms of other types of things like the query time. In terms of query time, it's a little bit different. We have smaller, this is a fairly idle instance, so config transactions is taking up the most query time. Command time, again, is the zip codes collection is taking up the most time. We can look at it in terms of command counts, read lock time, write lock time, and you can see a lot of different things on write lock, overall I/O time, and I/O counts as well. So a lot of different views for the same collection information to see what is the top collection in those different areas. And as I mentioned before, this is coming from our local cache repository, and you have total control over how much data is being stored there. You can see here we have some of these collections turned on. They're being collected at different intervals. We're retaining by default a week's worth of data, but this can be extended to several weeks of data. We can also export them to a central repository, which could be a real database. We can export it to that, and then from there it can then run longer-term reports like trend analysis of space and those kinds of things over a longer period of time of several months, for example, and do other types of aggregation as well. We also have alerting off of this, off of Mongo, covering several different areas that we saw, and then that creates alerts in our alerting system. And we can see here, we currently don't have any alerts at the moment, but you can see that you would see the alerts show up here with red, green, yellow, and the messages. We also take a look at it in terms of databases as well. So you can see here, right now everything is green, but they would show up in yellow, green, red, those kinds of things. And then I could drill down and see, okay, what are the individual alerts for that particular database? And we can also look at it in terms of server as well. So going back to the slides, that's a little bit about our MongoDB monitoring. There's actually a lot more to it, but we need to get on to our next database, which is PostgreSQL. PostgreSQL is going back to our relational database monitoring that we normally do. This is available actually in Surveillance 4.8. The Mongo that we saw earlier was available at 5.1. The Postgres is available starting with 4.8. So depending on your environment, if you need to add PostgreSQL, it may be more beneficial to stay on 4.8 to add it to your existing environment. But if you're deploying, of course, brand new installations, 5.1 may be the way to go. So in our 4.8 release, we released surveillance for PostgreSQL as well as surveillance for AWS Aurora, because now that we have MySQL monitoring and PostgreSQL, we're able to monitor both variations of Aurora. As well as we have other enhancements in 4.8, including enhancements to recent history. If you caught our earlier webinar, you know that we added some nicer things in recent history to show comparison between SQL runtimes of different time periods more easily, because you can already do that when you open up multiple tabs. As we saw, you could run different reports, different time periods. It's like that top SQL by time range stuff. You can run that in one tab and then run another tab, and you can do other things to do comparisons. But we make it more easy in the 4.8 enhancements that we did. You can also search the SQL history. So if you want to look for performance of a particular SQL, or in some cases, if you want to see the query plan, and some of the monitoring that we do for other databases, we show the query plan. We are bringing query plans, by the way, to Mongo and others as well. But right now, there's currently the SQL text. But the searching the SQL history in order to be able to find those items and then being able to see the related information is something you can do at 4.8. And then we also have more drill down. So those are items that we'll be covering in our upcoming webinar on the webinar regarding Neo4j and also the web reports and time slicing. That'll be covered in there. So when we monitor PostgreSQL, we have, again, familiar areas as well as additional areas for Postgres. We have overall health of the PostgreSQL instance. We have lock information. We have database information. And the database information is primarily, especially about connection counts, if you have connection count limits, as well as some other areas in there. We also have table space information. So in terms of space usage, the table spaces is what we show in PostgreSQL. And to get some of this information, we're also, in addition to maybe getting it out of the database, we're also doing other ways of getting it from the OS and other things to correlate it to be able to show this kind of information. Because some of this information is not available directly from Postgres, at least not in the default installations. We also have information on database I/O, and actually we have several different views of the database I/O, so that's really great to see a couple different ways. And of course, we also have our system settings window where you can see just the change settings again, or you can see all of the settings and search that and save that off as well. We also, of course, have processes to show who's connected to the Postgres. We have the current execute statements with the full SQL text. And again, the full SQL text is available for several different windows for processes, open transactions, block processes. We show open transactions in another view if you want to see just what's open in terms of that. We also have block processes to see who's blocking who in a particular instance. And we also have recently executed statements, which is a listing of statements that have been executed as time goes on. And that's what we use to build out to things like the top SQLs and those kinds of reports. In the recent history, of course, we have top SQL by time range and top SQL by hour of day, very similar to what we saw for Mongo, except in terms of SQL. Now, to do PostgreSql monitoring, we rely on several common extensions. So, because there are a couple things that we do need to get extra that comes out of the box. So, PG-stat statements is a major one that we need to have installed in there, and we help explain how to install that in case it's not there. If you do have PG-stats installed, of course, we need to have that in the shared preload libraries of the comp file, or there's a way to do alter system and then restart and things like that. But usually, it's easier to do it through the comp file. In case you're interested in how that's set up. We also use PG weight sampling as an item to get some information. We also need a DB link extension for some things to help correlate some information, extend the information that we have, and then of course PL PG-SQL, which is already installed by default and doesn't require anything extra. Now, when we decided on which extensions we were going to use, we made sure to carefully pick the extensions so that we would be on the approved list of Azure and other cloud services, because you don't want to get into an extension and then find out it's not available on your particular cloud service. And so we curate this as best as we can to make sure it's available on all the different places. Surveillance supports PostgreSQL versions 9.5 all the way to the latest 13.0 that just came out. Our executable for it is called DBGPG, as you might expect. Very similar to what we have for other naming of other executables. It connects to the database using the PostgreSql ODBC driver, the A version of the driver, as you can see here. Now, the PostgreSql ODBC driver is one of those things where normally you'd have to go out and make it, or maybe build it or something like that. That's not a problem with surveillance. We automatically provide the driver in the distribution, again, as an automatic support pack, except on Windows, but on Linux, on Unix, we provide that automatically out of the box. The only thing that you need to have is the PostgreSql client libraries, which known as libpq, for example, and that's usually a pretty easy install, a pretty minimal install. It's not the full-blown Postgres server installation or anything like that. So if you need to monitor remotely, most of the time we prefer to monitor locally to a database. That helps us provide us access to the error logs and other local things, and also provides better reliability overall in terms of the network, just in case. But if you need to go remote, if you want to put surveillance on another machine and then monitor that remotely, then you just need a minimal amount of stuff on that machine, like PostgreSql client libraries. On Windows, we need the ANSI version of the Postgres ODBC driver, and that's going to be 32-bit or 64-bit, depending on which version of surveillance. Because in Surveillance 5.1, we went 64-bit on Windows Server, so that's going to require the 64-bit ODBC driver, but on 4.8, that's the 32-bit one. And even though it's called the ANSI version of the driver, it does support UTF-8 and other types of features. So the other driver is an OCS2 driver, which is totally different. It's 16-bit wide, and not what we need. Definitely not what most people need, I believe. So but for the most part, a lot of this is very seamless and very easy to get going and up and running. The connect string is, again, the familiar host name with the optional port and database when you're creating the entity. The database user, the requirements for that in Postgres depend on the version of Postgres. If you're in 9.6 or later, then it's just the PG monitor role. But if you're earlier, or even in 9.6, we pretty much need the super user privilege as well. So for 9.5, 9.6, probably super user to get that going. But for later versions, it's just simple PG monitor role. And of course, if you terminate commands, which you can do in the UI, if you want to click on a command that's running or SQL that's running, you can easily terminate that command, that SQL item, and that's going to maybe require additional privileges for the admin user that you type in for that. We also recommend a few database options for PostgreSQL. The track IO timing, if you turn that on, we get additional information. The activity query size, it'd be nice to have a little bit more than 1,000 characters. So 8K is what we recommend. And then the track activities being on, which is the default, is also something we need in case that's been turned off, best with it on. Okay, so we'll take a look a little bit at how that goes. We'll switch back over to the web client, and we'll go down into our PostgreSql agent. And you can see here I have an older 9.6 and another version here as well. Again, we can take a look at processes that are out there. So here we have processes out there. So it's a pretty idle instance, so there's not much going on at the moment. But you can see here we have a couple different PIDs out there, the application, the login time for that application, So the usual kinds of things you'd expect from a monitoring product. We have things like the last query start time. In Postgres, you have states that it goes into, so you have the different information about states and when they've entered different states. And of course, we have the client IP address and host information as well. And when you click on it, we also see the full SQL text going on as well. You can see here we have the select going on our particular product as well. That's by processes. If we want to look at it by currently executing statements, we can also do that. Similar kinds of things, the SQL text at the bottom, client information. Open transactions is a little bit different. Now, unfortunately, I don't have an open transaction. I had a little bit of a problem before the webinar here. So we don't have a transaction at the moment, but you can see the kinds of information we provide are things like the database, the virtual transaction ID, transactions are going to be nested, so there's some information to help you correlate in terms of nesting. There's login information, the application name is available. And of course, when you click on the transaction, you can also see the full SQL text on the bottom. And then we also have information on locks. So this in terms of locks that are out there that have been granted or that are being requested. So these are all granted, but if they were not granted, then you'd have it requested or something like that. You can see the full SQL text of that session, that process that's going on. The type of lock. Now here we get more information on the locks in PostgreSQL. We actually get like the full schema name, the object name. So we're resolving all that information for you through certain techniques just to help get more information rather than just getting the low-level information for that. And we get the lock mode, the relation type, the lock type. In this case, we have some relation, virtual transactions. So there's several different locks that get taken out in different operations in PostgreSQL that you can see here. We also have information on block processes. Now, I don't actually have any block processes going on, but again, we'd have information on databases, PIDs, whoever's blocking would show up here, elapsed time. In terms of if you have a block tree going on where there's multiple levels or different people being blocked, you can get a total count of that particular item. This especially helps when you're doing alerting, as we'll see, as well as client information as well. We also have database information. So here we have the total database size for a database. So if we wanted to, we could take a look at that over time in the reporting, for example. We can see whether they're allowing connections, what percentage of the number of connections that are available is used. So if you have a connection limit, you want to alert on if you're running out of connections, you can easily do that through the product. And this, of course, you can save this off, and most of the things that we see here in the various windows, you can alert on, or you can do other operations on as well. We also have information on table spaces. So here we can see I have two table spaces, the default and the global setup. So not much going on. We can see the total usage. Not much. They're they're only about half full right now. What percentage? 47%. Free. Total information, file system information, the mount points, the critical information for those particular table spaces. And this is just this particular installation is just a generic CentOS rollout, but anything more interesting would also show up here as well. We have information on system settings. Again, we have the change settings versus all the settings, and these are the items that are non-default settings. And we also show the default items as well. For that, the searchable and savable as well. And we have all settings. We can actually take a look at different areas of Postgres. So if I wanted to take a look at, let's say, query tuning, query optimizer settings, these are those particular settings that are on this instance of Postgres. Now, database I/O, we have actually looked into the database I/O information in several different methods. We have it by total counts. So we can see the database. We have the number of backends on here. So that the number of backends is the number of processes, essentially. And then we have transactions per second. Let me go ahead and refresh this so we can see some more information. And you can see I have only one database right now that's having a lot of activity. Not much activity. We can see that broken down by commits, rollbacks. We can see conflicts, deadlocks, a lot of different ways of taking a look at it in terms of the total number of counts of operations, tuples inserted, those kinds of things. We can also take a look at it in terms of I/O. We can take a look at it, and you can see the bytes being read per second, the different summations on the read percentage, fetch percentages, I/O time, those kinds of things. We can also take a look at it in terms of hits. So here we have the hit ratios for the different databases, the reads per second, fetches, those kinds of things as well on this one. And then we can also take a look at it in terms of temp. So if you want to see the temp usage per second as it's going up for different databases, the temp files, the number of temp files, the total temp, those kinds of things are also available. So a lot of different ways of taking a look at the I/O on a particular database. And then we also have recently executed statements out here that are the various statements that are running here, and you can see the SQL text as well. And of course, we also have the recent history for PostgreSQL, just like we did for Mongo and for other relational databases. So I can take a, let's say, at the last 3 hours and see what the top items are on this particular one. And you can see here I have just a select statement going on that's taking a certain amount of time. And this is broken down, you can see by I/O time versus non-I/O time. And this is, we're looking at it in terms of the timing, but we can also take a look at it in terms of I/O. And under I/O, we have information, again, on I/O time, but we also have blocks fetched, number of calls, number of rows, shared blocks read versus hit, local block information, which we have local blocks read versus hit, and then also temp I/O. So just a lot of information in terms of the I/O usage of these different commands as well. Okay, so and one more thing I'll mention here before we go back to the slides is you can also take a look at the alerting on here. We have a lot of different alerts that are available, including things like a block situation. So if there's like a big blocking situation going on, we have thresholds that you can set, like the number of people that need to be involved, the duration of it, and we can send out a message that PID so-and-so has been blocking this and that. We have conditions and stuff you can set. A lot of this is configurable. A lot of this you can create your own rules. You can change our own rules. A lot of different things you can do. We have information on the longest running statements, critical table spaces that are running low on space. We have informational messages and those kinds of transactions, those kinds of things as well. So briefly, that's a bit about our Postgres monitoring, and then briefly on some other items that we have in our 5.1. This is a little bit of a rehash of the earlier webinar. As I mentioned earlier, we're going 64-bit on Windows, so that does affect a few things in the product. As we saw on the Postgres side, we need a 32-bit version of the driver. That, for the most part, it's pretty seamless, but on Windows, there are some utilities that are 64-bit, and then there are things like our thin client that still remains 32-bit. Most important, though, the files have moved to different new locations, so that may impact things like if you have scripts and stuff. If you're using the product on 4, for example, those are the things that may change. And then also a word about our HTML5 client. What we saw earlier was our Flash client. We also have an HTML5 client that's arriving in Surveillance 5.2. And it will be available for earlier versions too. We will be backporting that as patches available to pretty much all the versions of surveillance that are out there. And then some functionality, of course, it's available only in 4.8 or later, maybe not available in that client. But for the most part, all the things you'd expect are in that client. And of course, some people are concerned about TLS 1.3. We already support TLS 1.3 in Surveillance 4.7 or later to provide the latest and greatest for that, even if your platform doesn't natively support it. So for example, Red Hat 7 will never get TLS 1.3 support natively, but we do support TLS 1.3 even on those platforms. Now, if you're interested in seeing more of the Bradmark product yourself, you can go see our version 4 product currently out there on demo.bradmark.com. That's available during certain time periods. You can flash back to those time periods, and that's our current 4-point product. And then we'll be updating that with our 5.0 product that will probably be on a different port, and that's going to be available with different things as well. And this is what it looks like a little bit. You can see here, this is our Cybase monitoring, where we're seeing the current running batches out there during a blocking scenario. Okay, so we'll go into Q&A if there are any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Ed, very much for that presentation. Appreciate it. Just looking for any questions that might pop up. A lot of new information. I think people are digesting a little bit.
So somebody asked if 4.8 is available right now. 4.8 will be available very shortly, any day now. Unfortunately, like everybody else, with the COVID situation, things have been a little bit delayed. But we do hope to have that out very soon now. And then also 5.1 should be available in the next few weeks as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. That's great. Well, okay, that's wonderful, and we appreciate you joining today. And if you can join us for our final surveillance preview webcast, November 10th, as Ed again will present a deep dive session into Neo4j, web reports, and time slicing. Have a great day, and please stay safe.